everyone. Welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers from across the literary spectrum, though predominantly my folks in the crime fiction writing world, which is my favorite genre to read. I like to talk with them about their work and how they do what they do, and hopefully we'll all glean a little something out of it. I know I certainly have over the years from the many wonderful guests that I've had on this show. Real quick note before we get into things today, I'll let you know, remind you, we are on both YouTube and on as a podcast. So you can find the show under that name, The Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, on every major podcast platform out there, as well as YouTube. And if you would be so kind as to hit the subscribe button, that'd be great. A nice 5-star review would be even better, because then that makes it easier for folks to find the show. And hopefully they too can start gleaning some fabulous information about writing and publishing from my array of many extremely talented guests, like my guest today. If you've been following the Open Mic for any length of time, you'll remember that Paul Levine was on the show back in the day when we were just a blog. I will say his writing has only got better. He is the author, the man behind the great Jake Lassiter crime fiction series, also the Solomon and Lord series, some standalones. He was a writer for television with the TV show Jag, a man of just many, many talents. And I'm really happy to welcome him back to the show today, Mr. Paul Levine. Paul, how are you doing today?
Thank you, Rich. Pleasure to be here. Always great to talk to you about the craft. And when you say your listeners learn things, I learn things. So, love this.
Great. Well, that's always the main goal, right? Is we hopefully we all learn a little something. I just finished your newest book, which is the final in the Jake Lassiter series, Early Grave. I'm going to hold it up for the folks watching on YouTube. As always, I love this book. I will say I finished it. It was a little bittersweet because, as I noted, it's the 15th and the final book in the series. I know from our previous conversations that this was the plan for a long time, but I want to get into a little bit of the book itself in just a minute, but I always have to ask, was it hard for you to write those last few words even though you've known this was coming for a while? How was it for you to get to the actual end where you're typing those words, the end, not just on a book, but on the series?
Are you trying to make me cry on your podcast? I would say it was emotional. But actually, every book, when I get to the last chapter and the last few pages, I'm feeling some odd tugs and pulls inside me emotionally. And with this one, really a lot, because this ends the series that started in 1990, which is 33 years ago, with To Speak for the Dead. And unlike some series characters, I aged him over the years. So it's sort of a question, well, how long is he going to keep going? And I thought it was the right time to end the series.
Well, and it's interesting that you aged him, because I think that's a choice every author that writes a series has to make. Does my character stay forever young, or are they going to age and deal with the things that come with aging, especially if you're someone when you're fighting crimes? Or now, of course, he's a lawyer, but he's a very physical lawyer, shall we say. Was that always the goal when you wrote that first one? You say, I'm going to write a bunch of these, and I want him to age as the stories go forward?
Well, certainly way back in 1988, which is when I started writing To Speak for the Dead, I had no idea that I'd be writing this character for 33 years. So it would have to have been maybe in the late 90s with the books State versus Lassiter, maybe Mortal Sin, that I started giving them maybe a couple of gray hairs. But as you suggest, Rich, you have a choice to make. and some series characters never age. Some age, I'm going to say, in 2/3 time. 30 years go by, they're 20 years older. If you take someone like Scott Turow's great character, Rusty Sabich, who we met as a prosecutor and presumed innocent in about, I'm going to say 1987. And then 30 years later, might be 20 years, but he aged him when he wrote Innocent, which was basically a long-awaited sequel to Presumed Innocent. He aged him in the exact number of years that had passed. And his lawyer, Alejandro Stern, also aged and basically was dying when he was trying his last case. I took something of a middle ground. I aged him not as much as I have aged in 33 years, but more than just keeping him the same. And the difference in this character and all of those other series characters is that because Lassiter, though he's a lawyer, was a pro football player and suffered a number of concussions about the time that we all became aware of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, he began displaying symptoms in bum rap, bum luck, and bum deal. And the symptoms were getting worse. And he meets a woman, really meets his neuropathologist, who he then has a relationship with, which let me do the personal story. And Jake's personal story is sort of twofold. One, it's a relationship with his wonderful woman physician and researcher. And two, his medical condition and its worsening nature. So whatever case that he's trying, or murder trial, or in the case of Early Grave, a civil suit for damages, all of that is in the background.
Well, and it was a really interesting choice, and I always admired it because, we are a nation obsessed with football, and it was always an interesting characterization because, and I'm not going to give away anything to anyone too much that is going to ruin any storylines, but of course his nickname was Wrong Way Lassiter because he very famously in his career picked up a fumble and ran the wrong way, and i.e. Jim Marshall of the Vikings many years ago. And so that part of his backstory, there was always this element of humor to it, right? I want to talk with you in a little bit about the use of humor in your writing. But CTE, of course, is very, very serious, and to the best of our knowledge, at least now, incurable, right? We almost always only truly can diagnose it post-mortem. So it was a real decision point to give him CTE. And I don't think anybody would have blamed you for not giving your pro football player character that disease, because the end result is obvious, but you did choose that. And you have connections to football, I know. And so maybe, walk me through it a little bit about that decision to have Jake Lassiter have CTE.
Right. Well, in the early books, of course, it was pre-CTE or pre our knowledge of it. Jake would talk about his turf toe that he got when he played on the artificial surfaces in the old days, when that was taken from something like Larry Zonko, and his toes swelled up to the size of an overripe avocado, and in that play, in the Wrong Way Lassiter play, again, pre-CTE, I actually had established that he got a concussion on the tackle, on the kickoff, and got spun around, and he's dizzy, and he picks up the fumble and he runs the wrong way. Well, years later, when all of this information about CTE is coming out, and with Dr. Ann McKee up at BU and the doctor in Pittsburgh and the studies, and this really made me do it, I think, the obvious fact that the NFL was so late in acknowledging that concussions and even subconcussive injuries, repetitive head slaps of a defensive lineman to an offensive lineman, or vice versa, over time can cause brain damage, which is what we're talking about. This is actually a brain disease. It increases this protein like sludge in the brain. In the NFL, not to be too harsh, but I compared the NFL to the tobacco companies and the asbestos manufacturers because they had information that they didn't act on. And if anything, if they didn't cover it up, they at least moved it back out of the public view. And I was really offended by that. And Jake calls CTE the industrial disease of the NFL. So I viewed it as a real societal issue. And if you can, in fiction, have a backdrop that's real, I think it makes the fiction better. The plot doesn't have to be something that actually happened, but set against this backdrop, it's a real story.
It is a real story, and it's a real story with one end. And that's, I guess, the thing, as a writer, you could not logically in any way have him come out of this okay and like there's a miracle cure or anything, because there's not, right? We see this all the time in stories.
As you said previously, right now, there is no cure.
And we see all the time in stories where somebody will, it drives me crazy on TV. Somebody will, get a serious gunshot wound and, a week later they're up, walking around like nothing ever happened and stuff. Then that's fine. Fiction is suspending our belief and disbelief systems. But CTE was such a serious thing, it's only going to end. Did you know at that point, well, okay, I've got maybe 3 books, 4 books because I can't now logically play this out for another 20 years, right?
Right.
So did you know that going in? It's like, okay, well, now that I've done it, I've got a limited amount of time.
I think so. And, way back when I was creating the Lassiter character, the model for Jake, loosely speaking, was Nick Bonaconte of the Miami Dolphins. I lived in Miami. It was a season ticket holder of the Dolphins. Met him in the past. We weren't friends. And he, of course, was an undersized linebacker who was a really, really good football player, better than Jake. Nick wore number 85. I gave Jake number 58, which is actually more of a linebacker's number. And fast forward just a couple of years ago, Nick Bonaconte died of CTE, captain of the defense. He also became a lawyer after he retired, hence the connection there. And he practiced law for a while before he went into business. Don Shula, Coach Shula, used to call Bonaconte the lawyer for the defense because he would argue so much with Don. So, yeah, there's that mirroring of reality. But now that we've talked about this so much, I want to loop back to something you said. This is not a grim book. There is a lot of humor in this book. I know it sounds funny to say that, but yes, there is.
Well, so let me touch on the humor part, because I did want to talk about that too. And I'm glad you circled back to that, because I want everyone who might be listening to this who's not familiar with your work. Yeah, this is not grim. None of the Jake Lassiter stories are grim. The subject matter is always serious, somebody getting killed, what have you. That's the nature of crime fiction. But Jake Lassiter has a great sense of humor. And there's so much in every story. I mean, it's not like he's cracking one-liners about everything but in the world, but he has a great perspective. It's a very smart-ass kind of humor, which I love. And it never crosses over into something that makes it slapstick or anything like that. It's still, I always come in from the perspective, my brother was a cop. I've had relatives who were like neonatal ICU nurses and everything. And I know for a fact, people in those professions have a very black sense of humor, because you could not possibly survive it without it. And that's what I've always seen with Lassiter. He's dealing with serious things and he deals with it with humor. That said, you were a reporter. before in a previous life. You've been a trial lawyer, neither of which are known for having a great sense of humor as part of the daily thing. So tell me about how you came
Well,
having such a good, solid, realistic sense of humor with these characters.
well, that's an important word to use, uh, realistic. I was a Miami Herald reporter, and I covered criminal court in Miami in the Justice Building, or as Jake Lassiter calls it, the so-called Justice Building. Um, and I was 21 when I started, right out of Penn State. Drove my Chevy to Miami to start my first job, and that's what I did. And I was surprised how much humor there was in this is a state court, criminal trials in state court. Federal court's a little bit different. It's a little stuffier, it's a little more formal. State court, at least back in those days, the judges knew every lawyer who was in the courtroom for, say, an 8 a.m. motion calendar. There might be 40 lawyers there. And there was bantering back and forth. And if there's one thing Jake is good at, it's bantering with a judge. Um, in one of the books, the judge says to Mr. Lassiter, if you persist in this line of questioning, I'm going to send you to a place you've never been. Jake goes, already been to jail, Your Honor. Judge said, not talking about jail, I'm talking about law school. So this is the kind of thing that Jake constantly engages in, and he's always flirting with contempt. He's always flirting and being held in contempt. Yes.
Well, you're a master at it. I will tell you, you really are a master at it. And I'll tell you that one of the things that I feel like I learned from you, from other conversations, but also from reading so many of your books, you have one of the great skills that crime fiction authors have to have, and that you write killer first lines. And I'm very aware of what I just said there. And I'm going to read one for the new folks, because this is my favorite of all of yours that I've read. 30 seconds after the jury announced its verdict, I decided to kill my client. That is a Jake Lassiter line. It's the opening to
Bum Luck.
Bum Luck, thank you. And it's just excellent. And I know I know you put a lot of effort into writing first lines. Tell me a little bit about that effort and your thought process behind putting all that effort into writing a great first line.
Well, I think all the effort is designed to make people read the second line. And I do think now it is more important to have a beginning, and that would include a great first line, but the first 8 to 10 pages that really sing and really hook the reader. Because if you go on Amazon and you come across, well, who's this guy, Paul Levine, Jake Lassiter? I never heard of him. I'm going to read this sample. And a sample pops up on your screen. Well, it's the first few pages of the book. So if the first sentence is 30 seconds after the jury announced its verdict, I decided to kill my client, the reader might say, why? Let me read the next paragraph. Although, Rich, I have another one that I like just as much as that. In my Solomon versus Lords series, which is a lighter tone series of capers with Steve Solomon and Victoria Lord, two lawyers who squabble, and then have a relationship. The opening line, I won't belabor it. The opening line of The Deep Blue Alibi is, forget it, Steve. I'm not having sex in the ocean. And I thought that, I don't know, it hooked me. It hooked me.
That's an attention getter.
Yeah, and then they're here in the water off of Key West, and a boat comes, nearly hits them, runs aground, and all these $100 bills start floating down. And I think, okay, I got my attention anyway.
Absolutely. See that. Well, and that is such a big part of things now, because Amazon giveth and it taketh away. That certainly there's more opportunity, but then that means everybody has that opportunity. So where your competition might have been this big, Now it's way like this big, right? So you really do have to work harder than ever to get somebody's eyeballs for more than one line. So you better make that first line really good.
Yes, yes,
Um,
agreed.
but before we leave football, I want to just stick on one more football question, which is, you've more than just the CTE, you've always done a pretty good job of weaving in the ramifications of a football career on characters. Um, and certainly in Early Grave, the theme of the story isn't Jake's CTE. That's one theme, but the real theme is that his godson suffers a horrifying spinal injury. And I have very distinct memories of seeing Steve Utley um, and others suffer those kinds of injuries. And it's just always such a reminder that the NFL and all of football at any level is really a brutal game. Again, I mentioned earlier, you're a Penn Stater, Miami, you love football, but it really is a brutal game. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on again, always making sure that you include that aspect into these players' lives later on and showing those repercussions.
Right. And as you point out, Jake is filing a suit on behalf of his godson, who suffered a catastrophic injury in a high school football game, perhaps because of bad equipment and bad high school coaching. And his godson's father is an old teammate of Jake's on the Dolphins. And even little things like when the father tries to get out of a booth in a bar, he weighs about 350 pounds. It takes a while to sit in Jake's old Cadillac or get out of the car. All of these guys have continuing injuries post-retirement. Forget CTE. I mean, we're talking about joint injuries and all of that. And then when you talk about CTE, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the 1972 Miami Dolphins, the undefeated team, the only perfect season in history of the NFL. Well, 6 of those guys, as Jake points out in Early Grave, are dead of CTE. Some others are dead of other things, but all at relatively young. None of those 6 lived to be an old man. And Jake says, perfect season, my ass. And that's, if you're going to do anything involving former NFL players and don't talk about the Tylenol they need every morning, noon, and night, you're not presenting the total picture.
I'm going to correct myself because I said we were leaving football, but I'm not actually quite going to leave it yet because I wanted to briefly discuss your last book before this one, before Early Grave, which was a book called Cheater's Game. And it is classic. That one right there, yes.
How about that for a prop?
It's a classic rip straight from the headlines theme dealing with a college admissions scandal. Now I know you wrote for TV, so doing something like that is kind of second nature, I guess, to some extent at this point. But as writers, we're always told don't chase trends, don't chase headlines and that stuff because the process is so long. By the time the thing comes out, the thing may be passé, what have you. And clearly, that hasn't been the case for you. But was that a concern for you at all when you wrote this? It's like, well, gosh, in a year and a half or 2 years, when this book finally sees bookstores, is anyone even going to care about this anymore? What was your thinking there?
Well, I absolutely thought of that because I started planning the book at the very, very beginning when those 50 some indictments came down, including a few of the Hollywood characters, which is the only reason it made the headlines it did. Then it took on a life of its own. But there are still a few cases unresolved from that. And in the indictments, I think, go back to 2018 or 19. So the reason, though, I thought the college admissions scandal was something that could be argued on both sides of the equation. And that is Obviously, it's wrong. I'm not going to say criminal, I'm going to say wrong, morally wrong for parents to bribe their kids' way into college, right? Is there anybody who would disagree with that? But what, how much difference is there? I really wanted to explore this between an outright cash bribe under the table to a field hockey coach or a diving coach, or getting your kid in because your grandfather built a $10 million building there and they don't care. And maybe now you, the parents, say, well, I'll endow a chair in the science department. That's about a $2.5 to $5 million gift. Yeah, your kid gets in. Morally, I don't think there's a difference. Now, criminally, maybe there is. But in the one case that went to a full jury trial, the great Miami lawyer Roy Black, somebody I've known for 50 years, did not plead his client guilty, took it to the jury, and basically made the argument that I just made, that admissions offices are part of the problem. In Cheater's Game, Jake cross-examines a fictional Stanford University admissions official, fictional. And when he goes through this whole process we've been talking about with the grandparents and the legacy admissions and the charitable contribution, he concludes by saying, isn't the problem here that my client bribed the wrong person? He should have bribed you, not this outsider. Anyway, the subject matter interested me, still does.
Yes, I agree, and I will also recommend that book. I'm going to recommend all Paul's books, but definitely these last two have really been excellent. Speaking of other books, let's talk about Solomon v. Lord for a moment, which is your other series. And as you noted, it's a little more lighthearted than the last series, but still a lot of good humor, but also really good, well-crafted crime fiction, fun plots, interesting stories, very interesting characters. What happens with them now? Are they going to be the focal point of all of your efforts, or maybe is there a new series that you're plotting? What is next for Paul Levine?
Well, I'm toying with a Solomon versus Lord idea, and the books actually are in development at NBC right now, which doesn't mean that there'll ever be a television series, but they're working on it. And if there is, probably would make sense to write more books. I've had several readers write me with a series idea, and that is that I pick up Rodrigo Pittman, Jake's godson, a few years after Early Grave is over, and he's a young lawyer, and he is guided by his memories of Jake, and he gets in some of the same scrapes, but he might even have Jake's nephew, Kip, as his private investigator. So there would be a lot of Jake in the background.
I love that idea.
Thank you.
I don't know which savvy reader sent you that email, but man, God bless them, right? That's a great idea.
I'm going to nod to Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports.
Oh, good job, Dennis. Good job, man. I'm all down with that, man. Well, before I go to my final question, I'm going to hold this up one more time. Everyone, Early Grave, highly recommend it. Also, I'm going to do something I've never done. I'm going to very briefly promote my own book, In Their Own Words. This came out a few years ago. This is my collection of some of my earlier interviews, conversations with great writers around the mystery field. Paul is in this book. There's a lot of stuff that is in that conversation. Of course, we didn't talk about today, not to be repetitive. A lot of other great writers too. I'm on Amazon, very easy to find. Don't do it for me, but if you really want to hear more from Paul, that's a great way to do it. And pick up a copy of Early Grave, Cheater's Game, any of them. And you know what? you can't go wrong going all the way back to 1990, right? And picking up To Speak for the Dead. That's a great way to start the Jake Lassiter series. Um, I'm gonna end with my usual thing, and I've done this with you before. I'm going to give you your options here. I'm going to throw three names at you. I can put you together with one of these three people for a great conversation, maybe dinner, not watching a football game, but maybe something similar that's fun. You tell me who you would choose and why, because you can only choose one. The options I'm going to give you are Mackenzie Scott, who's now one of the richest women in the world, courtesy of her ex-husband, Jeff Bezos. And actually seemingly a much better person than he is. Dr. Bennett Omalu, who I don't have to tell you is the man most credited with discovering CTE, though he's also become a fairly controversial figure.
Yes.
And then the man himself, the man behind the shield, Roger Goodell. I can put you together with one of those three to have a nice long conversation and maybe an adult beverage or two. Who would you choose and why?
I have written such negative things about Roger Goodell, somewhat in jest and somewhat not. I suppose that I could, if you could serve him with a subpoena so he would actually show up to this dinner, and I could ask him questions and he wouldn't invoke the Fifth Amendment, that could be interesting. Dr. Omalu, as you suggest, has become somewhat of a controversial figure for some of the claims that he made. Mackenzie Scott, her philanthropy is really something, and I think I would like to discuss that with her and see if she would get into some of the issues that interest me: pediatric cancer research and the Penn State sports programs. Mackenzie Scott.
Final answer. We like that. Well, I think it's a good choice. I think she's really been doing a lot of great things. I mean, a lot of people say they will do great things when they come into a lot of money, but she's actually been doing it, and her approach and everything is very interesting and very admirable. So, great choice. Paul, as always, fabulous conversation. I really, really appreciate you making the time to chat with me and to chat with the folks that watch this show. I think, as always, you've given them a lot of great stuff to think about and with their own writing or just in how they read books. And then, again, I know maybe I'm being a little broken record here, but I highly recommend it. If you haven't, find some of Paul's books and check them out because you won't regret it. Once again, really appreciate you being here, Paul.
And it was great pleasure. Always fun talking. Rich, in their own words, is on my Amazon page right now.
Fabulous. Well, I'll leave everybody then with that and with my usual thoughts, which is, if you haven't hit subscribe, please do so. Help other folks find the show, and hopefully they'll also be able to glean some great insights from some of my guests who I'm so very fortunate to have join me on a regular basis. One of your friends was recently on the show, Ed Zuckerman. He was also fabulous. Great new book called Wealth Management. So I tell you, folks, you're not going to find anything better for free. That's my own self-promotion there. But I will leave you this. Tomorrow, it's not promised to any of us, so please make today count. Until next time, for my guest, Paul Levine, for myself, Rich Eisen, you've been listening to The Open Mic. Take care.